Let's talk about desktop Mac, specifically Mac Mini M2 and M2 Pro. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. I'm back with my iPad and I have a stack of Mac Mini. I should do a guessing game which one is which because from the camera perspective, they all look the same. Anyhow, if you have been following the channel, thank you. If you're new, welcome. I'm glad to have you here. As usual, I'll be sharing with you a lot of test results, and I highly encourage that you pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself in addition to my analysis that I will be sharing with you. If you're new, definitely sit through a few of these introduction slides because it's going to give you an insight as to why I test the way how I do it. But if you want to skip ahead, I'll leave timestamp in the description below as well. Alright, so what we're going to do is talk about the Mac Mini, and we're going to be comparing the M1, M2, and the M2 Pro chip together. So this is a focus on the smaller desktop Mac per se. Let's have a look at our test system. There are three Mac Minis that we'll be looking at, the M1, M2, and the M2 Pro. A few things to note about this is that when it comes to the M2, that is the only configuration you have option-wise. When it comes to the M2 Pro, this is the base configuration, and there is another one with 12 CPU and 19 GPU, although I did not upgrade my system to that one. I did, however, bump up the memory on all these machines. However, on the M2, there is an option for 24 gigabytes of memory. I did not go with that option. I feel that 16 gigabytes is probably the magic number for majority of the people that want to use these computers in a creative capacity. And if you feel like you need more, well, you're going to see some of the charts that will show you the benefit of having more RAM on the system anyway. The other two reference system I'm going to include as well is the M1 Max and also the M1 Ultra. Both of these are stock configuration from Apple. Nothing has changed. I have not gone in and upgrade anything at all because I feel like they're mid-tier to like higher end machines, and stock configuration tends to work fairly well on those. Another thing I want to call our attention to is the pricing of these machines. Now, the M1, I put an asterisk there because that's the pricing when it was released. The M2, the price, I mean, it's always really been priced competitively. However, interestingly enough, the M2 Pro and the M1 Max Studio, the pricing for these two are pretty much within a striking distance of each other. So we're going to be taking a look at those performance just roughly in this video. I'll probably make another separate video that goes over the analysis between those two in a little bit more greater depth. And you can see the pricing of the M1 Ultra as well. So that really just takes it to the next leap. Now, another thing I really want to go over is testing configuration because I get so many requests to test specific hardware configuration, and they're very difficult to do because that would entail that I would go and order a specific machine with that configuration. And I think the better thing to do would be to really look at my analysis and listen to what my analysis are, because I will tell you what type of system resources are being used when that app is running doing those specific tasks. And you can extrapolate from there based on your workflow what you may or may not need and how the system that you may order is going to perform. Ultimately, they're going to be fairly close to each other for the most part, with certain things that may just be a little bit faster than another, but they're not going to make too big of a difference. So those are the things that I would think about. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is pretty much the SoC segmentation, or just the chip in general. And this is something that we have to realize, that Apple creates two lines of chip, one that is more consumer leaning, the other one that is more pro oriented. So the pro-oriented chip is going to be able to do more, link to more displays. You're going to be able to push it harder. It's going to have more GPU in the system and so forth. So when you're really consider configuring the computer for your workflow, just think about where you're really going with this. Because if you're just casually using the computer, the consumer-oriented may be fine. However, if you're really doing this as a pro, as a creative, for monetary compensation, you know, let's say you do work for people, I think that definitely choosing the more pro-oriented chip is going to make a lot of sense because, I mean, you're getting paid for the job. These things are going to pay for itself in no time, in the amount of time that you're going to save doing your work. So those are things to think about. And as always, I'll be approaching this from a pro photographer perspective and one who does video. Now, one of my comments that I receive about the video is that I'm not pushing them quite as hard, and that's absolutely true because this is pretty much just my workflow. I film most of the time in the studio, and if I go outdoors, I make sure that I have adequate enough lighting so I don't have to really do a lot of noise reduction. But I am looking into method of how to test those. But as of now, these are going to be just the test method that are more relevant to my workflow at this point in time. Now, I'm also doing a lot of single app testing. In fact, it's exclusively single app testing because I want to see how the silicon is performing one generation to the next and how they compare, for example, the different like silicon configurations that are available. Another thing to note about all these is that I have retested everything using the current version of macOS and the latest software release for those specific apps that are on the market. So some of you may have seen other videos that I've done in the past and said that, for example, this specific machine configuration ran faster on those machines, and that's absolutely true, especially with Lightroom Classic. But with the current version for the OS and the app, this is how they run. So I have gone back and pretty much, again, retested everything, and this took a lot of time to do. All right, my initial impression of the Mac Mini is that it is a Mac Mini. Exact same design, exact same shape, not so much has changed. So, I mean, there's not a lot to say about that. When it comes to display and calibration, I was able to successfully do a hardware calibration and also software calibration on these machines. So there's not a lot of big changes that have happened in the underpinning system from the M1 going forward, and that's a good thing. And also the software has been upgraded to take advantage of Ventura and everything. So we should be really good to go for the most part with display calibration. One of the things though that I do want to point out with the M2 Mac Mini, and this is something that I said in my configuration videos, that on the Thunderbolt 4 ports, there's only 2 of them on the M2, and there are 4 of them on the M2 Pro, but on the M2 now you can run displays from both of the Thunderbolt 4 ports at the very same time. So you can have one display link up to one port and another display link up to the other Thunderbolt port, and it will work. This is something that did not function on the M1, where on the M1 you have to use one Thunderbolt and the other one you have to just use the HDMI, and there are no other options. So that is one, I would say, definite big improvement, although you're fairly limited on the number of ports on the machine to really start out with already. All right, a few things about reading the specs of the machine that you're going to see in the chart. I'm going to put this up so you just get an idea as to what I am referring to. You can always reference back on this. Okay, let's talk about SSD, because I feel like this is one of those big conversations. So one thing that I will say about SSD is that you can configure it at any capacity that you really need. And I would really look at your workflow as how much capacity you need now and what you may need in the future. And don't go buy a larger SSD because it's going to have a faster read and write speed, because at the speed that these computers are currently reading and writing at, it's going to be negligible for your workflow, and I can guarantee you that much. So choose the one you want, and remember that with regards to SSD, you can always expand storage after you purchase the machine with external drive, external SSDs and everything. And this is pretty much the SSD speed for all of these machines tested together. Now, just looking at this chart in general, I would probably say that, I mean, the M2s and the M2 Pros are performing pretty much a little bit better than the M1s actually. Now, granted, this is the 512 gigabyte model. I don't have the 256 one, but again, one of the arguments that I've also made is that if you're really using a machine for pro workflow where you may see a difference, and I'm not saying that you will, but where you may notice some of the difference, you're going to be getting more higher configuration machine anyway. So those are just really things to think about. Now, I've also made a video that talks specifically about SSD speed and why it really doesn't matter doing a lot of imaging exporting and everything like that. And I can tell you right now that even Lightroom Classic or Final Cut Pro, when I'm doing a lot of editing or heavy editing or image compositing and everything, it's really reading at a peak of maybe like 300 megabytes per second. And I'll leave a link to this video up here and also in the description below so you can check that out. So like I said, speed versus size. Get the size that you need and don't worry about the speed factor of this whole thing. It doesn't really matter. All right, moving on to RAM. RAM is one of those variables in these systems that you cannot upgrade post-purchase. So I would think hard about how much RAM you need on the system. And with the SSD, like I said, if you go into 512, you can always expand it but with external storage. But with RAM, you cannot add anymore. You are pretty much just fixed the way how it is that you have configured it. So Definitely consider your use case and your modality, whether you're using a desktop, laptop, and which one is your primary machine. If this computer is going to be your only machine, then I would definitely give it more RAM than less, because more RAM is definitely just going to be better overall in the long run. Now, for these Mac Mini, I would say that you can really upgrade to 24, upgrade to 32, and you're going to be okay. It's not one of those like crazy things. There are some arguments out there that, you upgrade the RAM as much as you can afford it, but I mean, at some point, for example, going to 128, that's exorbitantly expensive on, for instance, the Mac Studio. And if you can't utilize that, then it doesn't really make a lot of sense to really think about the use case. Now, to help you with this, I have two utilities I want to share with you. One of them is called the Activity Monitor in Mac OS. So if you're really just doing work, start this up, launch Activity Monitor, and just have it monitor your memory pressure throughout the day and see how much memory you're using as you're going through your creative workflow. Pay attention to the memory pressure graph. And by the way, just make sure you're in the memory tab at the very top. But the memory pressure graph should be green. If it's yellow or red, that means you probably need more memory. If you're coming from an Intel machine, however memory you have there, I would configure it about the same and not less. So those are things to think about. If you want to have a better utility for tracking your memory pressure and also the memory usage system, I highly recommend looking at iStat menu. I'll leave a link in the description below. I am not affiliated with them, but I love their app because it gives you data and you can extrapolate it by hour, 24 hours, 7 days, or up to like 30 days, and will keep track of the trends that how you have been using your machine. So like I said, consider your use case. For some, 16 gigabytes is going to be enough. If you don't work with large files all the time and you don't have multiple programs open, you're going to be okay. If you're a pro, or if you just work with a lot of photography, you want to be on the safe side of things, you want to have a machine that may last a little bit longer for you, I would highly encourage going to 32 gigabytes. And there are a few charts that will tell you exactly where RAM comes into benefit, and I'll point that out as well. All right, testing time. Let's take a look at Lightroom Classic, M1 versus M2 versus M2 Pro. This has been tested on macOS Ventura 13.2 with Lightroom Classic version 12.1 with full hardware acceleration support on all of these systems. Lightroom Classic one-to-one preview. So this is what we're looking at. The fastest one out of the bunch right now is the Mac Mini M2 Pro. And then now we have the Mac Mini M2 and the M1 following and trailing down that way. Amazingly enough, the Mac Mini M1 has been a great performer for the longest time, and with some specific version of the OS and Lightroom Classic, I mean, it really outperforms a lot of the other machines. That's really no longer the case in the current software that we have right now. So what I want to share with you is the percent differences between all of these. So for instance, going from the M2 Pro to the M2, we're gaining about a 25% improvement. Now, really think about the pricing increase of that machine. I would say that if you want to work faster in your workflow, this is definitely worth it. Now, going from the M1 to the M2, we're only gaining about like 9% at the very most in terms of speed increase. So I wouldn't say like it's a big deal. This will be more of I would say a lateral upgrade anyway. So if you're really thinking about upgrading, and if you already have an M1, I would probably go to the M2 Pro and not necessarily just the M2. This is based on these chip configurations, so those are the things to think about. Now, let's throw in the result from the two Mac Studio in and see how they perform. So the M1 Max, interestingly enough, I'm going to point this out, and like I said, I'll do another video that talks about this more in depth, is that the M2 Pro is beating out the M1 Max already. That's the base configuration, and these are the base configuration for both of these chips respectively. So just think about this for a second. If we upgrade the M2 Pro to the 12-core CPU and 19-core GPU, chances are it would even beat out the M1 Max by a little bit more of a greater margin than what we're seeing now. Right now, it's really close. It's already beating out. We're probably going to see more of that. And as always, the M1 Ultra still rules supreme when it comes to all these tests at this point in time. Let's take a look at the export result. M2 still the fastest, and the timing on this is, I mean, I'll tell you, this is really impressive. And when I do another conclusion video at the end of all of this, when we compare all the machines, you're going to find that this number is really astonishing what it can do. All right, so let's take a look at the M2 and the M1. You can see how the numbers start to cascade and the time start to increase there. As far as percentage goes of time improvement, we're looking at 38% going from the M2 to the M2 Pro. I say that's definitely worth it. The numbers are high enough that justifies the price increase. As far as the M1 to the M2 export goes, we're looking at around 26% improvement. I mean, it's not insignificant, but I would probably say I would rather take the bigger leap and cut the export time by more than half going to the M2 Pro. So that's just my thought about this, especially now that Apple has released those machines. Those are really things to think about. The other thing I also want to comment on as well is that the M2 Pro machine definitely runs hotter, and the fan does definitely runs a lot more than, for example, the M1 chip that come before. The M1, you can rarely ever hear it. You touch the machine, it's not hot at all, even though you push it hard. On the M2 Pro, you do feel it, and it feels more of like the Intel generation Mac Mini where everything is just hot, but you know is running way more efficient than the Intel chip. So that's just some extra observation I want to share with you. And Lightroom Classic Export 1K, you can see the result there. And this is the reason why I said the M2 Pro is super impressive, because it's literally, again, beating out the M1 Max base configuration. This is just the base M2 Pro. We're not even bumping anything up yet. And as always, the M1 Ultra still reigns supreme in all this, so you get to see the spread right there. Let's take a look at Lightroom Classic HDR Merge. For this, the timing, they're only a few seconds apart. I would attribute this to majority of them being a margin of error, even though, yeah, this spread does definitely make sense with the 3 Mac Mini machines, and also the spreads that we're seeing down here with the Pro machine does make sense. But again, the M2 is breeding out the M1 Max, and this is a constant theme that we'll probably see with Lightroom Classic. Let's take a look at a panorama merge, combining 14 Nikon DA10 36 megapixel into a large 314 megapixel DNG file. And this is the timing between all of these. Now, there are a few factors that I also want to point out as well with regards to these timing, because this is a CPU and RAM based task. So the number of CPU cores between these systems are pretty much very similar. This one has 2 more, so it has like a +2 on the other 2 systems. But the other thing that it also has as well is more memory. So you can see where memory really starts to play a role when you start to work with large files. So having 32 definitely helps. Having, for example, like 16 gigabytes definitely is going to help. But the chip and the speed of the CPU itself is playing a role in how these graphs are cascading the way how they are right now. What I'm going to do now is throw in the result for the Mac Studio in, and a couple of things really just are very interesting. So for example, the M1 Max is not really doing that well on this task at all. In fact, it's even slower than the Mac Mini M1 on the base configuration in general. I probably have to run this test on another time just to verify the result. But normally when the results are this high, I usually verify the result, and I did do it a few times on this one, and this is the number that we're still getting. So it's rather interesting. And another thing to note about this is that 32 gigabytes may not mean much when the computer can't really, or the app can't really utilize it fully, even though it has 10 CPU, very similar to this one. But the timing is, close to 30 seconds longer. But when it comes to the M1 Ultra, I mean, that's still, again, reigns supreme, half of pretty much everything, or half even the M2 Pro right now where we're sitting at. All right, let's take a look at Lightroom. This is, again, Ventura 13.2, Lightroom version 6.1 with full support for hardware acceleration. So this is the graph. A lot of very interesting things happen with Lightroom Cloud version or Lightroom CC export. The first thing is that the M2 Pro didn't do too well on this one. I mean, it's not bad. The timing is about in line with Lightroom Classic, but I would expect it a lot more, because the way how Lightroom CC works, the export engine is different. It utilizes the CPU, GPU, and the RAM for everything, but we're not really seeing that right now. Interestingly enough, the M2 is the one with the shortest time, and the M1 is just the one that takes pretty much just the longest in this chart, and is longest by, I would probably say, like close to 3 times, or actually 4 times, depending on the computer that you're looking at right now. So this will give you a pretty good perspective, especially if you're using Lightroom Cloud version, but this result is totally different than what we have seen with Lightroom Classic. Throw in the result from the Mac Studio and we get a few interesting things. So M2 by itself beats out the M1 Max by a few seconds. Don't know how this happened. I did not switch the numbers. I ran double verification on these and this is still the result that we got. M1 Ultra, I mean, you're able to export 1000 Nikon D850 RAW files to JPEG in less than 3 minutes. That's just mind blowing. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, let's look at CaptureOne. Ventura 13.2, CaptureOne 23, version 16.0.2. Now, someone have commented on my video that CaptureOne renders preview for import very slowly because it's really designed as a tether workflow, and I totally understand. I greatly appreciate that comment. One of the things that I will say though is CaptureOne has been repositioning themselves, and they want to position themselves as more of the Lightroom competitor in a way for us just editors that will bring the pictures in large bulk and large quantity. And I think that if CaptureOne wants to really target, for example, someone like myself as the audience, they should really do a trigger somewhere where we can choose, is this going to be a tether focused workflow or a pretty much a desktop editing oriented workflow? So you can really choose the way how the CPU, the GPU are being cranked up and how the program is utilizing it. Otherwise, I'm always going to critique it, saying that the import previews on CaptureOne just really sucks in general. It's just really slow. And yes, granted, I crank up the preview all the way, and normally you don't do that. You do a lower size preview, but that's just how I'm, been testing these machines. So to keep everything consistent, I'm doing testing the same way. And the spread on these are pretty much as we would expect them. M2 Pro is coming out ahead, M2 and M1 to follow, but the gap between all of these are not quite as large as we would have expected. So this gives you an idea if you are a CaptureOne user and you want to get a good machine. I mean, technically the M2 may just do just fine and you're saving a lot of money. So as far as time improvement go between, for example, the M2 Pro and the M2, you're looking at 9%. M2 and the M1, you are looking at around a 10% speed improvement between all of these. And once we add in, for example, the Mac Studio, we see something that is, well, somewhat interesting, even though, for instance, the M2 Pro didn't really beat out the M1 Max, but it did come really close. I would say within like about a minute of each other. And the M1 Ultra, this, despite having double everything, the program doesn't really know how to go in and utilize these resources. And this is the problem that I have with CaptureOne. It doesn't scale. It should scale, but it doesn't scale. And even though the workflow and modality may be for tether capture, the fact that the program can't scale when there is resources available really leaves a lot of room for doubt in just the development of the software in general. Let's take a look at the export time. So the export time on this, CaptureOne utilizes a lot of GPU hardware acceleration on export. It barely touches the CPU on export when it's really doing all these tasks. And we can see the numbers that, for example, 16 core GPU definitely does help. 10 takes longer, and when it comes to 8, it takes definitely much longer. So this is giving us a few insights. So the first thing is that the M2 GPU are probably running faster, more efficient as well, in addition to having 2 more GPU cores. So we're seeing a double effect happening right now. And when we jump to the 16, obviously there are more cores on the system. So with this, we're seeing, for instance, between the M2 the M2 Pro and the M2, we're seeing about a 44% improvement in export time. So going up may be worth it, especially if you work with CaptureOne. When it comes to the M1 and M2, you're looking about a 24% improvement. I wouldn't say that that is an insignificant number, but at this point in time, if you're really looking at M2, I would just really bite the bullet and go for the Pro, because the Pro has way more working for it than the M2, and it really is giving just the base Mac Studio M1 Max a run for the money in multiple of these tests already. Here's the export result. When we add in the Mac Studio, you can see that the M2 Pro didn't really quite beat that out because this one still have 24 GPU core. But here's the thing, going from 24 to 48, the time on this, if you really think about apply just regular logic, you double the GPU core, the time should get cut in half, if not by about 1/3, and we're only really seeing about a 2-minute improvement. This is what I'm talking about in terms of system utilization and resources utilization in CaptureOne. That's all I'm going to say about that. All right, next up is Photoshop. And for this, I'm using Lloyd Chamber Test, Digital Lloyd. I'll leave a link to his tests in his website in the description below. You can check that out. We're going to be doing 3 tests, the speed, the medium, and the huge file. Now the huge is going to create a very large 56 gigabyte file that majority of us won't be seeing that. However, if you're one of those, then definitely this is going to show you where the benefit comes in. Photoshop speed comparing between 70 and 90% RAM. The two, I mean, I would probably say everything is milliseconds apart and wouldn't even worry about it. Throw in the result from the Mac Studio. It runs just a slight touch faster, but this is just a speed test. So this is telling you that they're performing pretty much all at about the same speed. And I'm using the computer to pretty much record the time that it's actually doing all these computations. Now, when it comes to Photoshop Medium, the 15.7 gigabyte, we're seeing a couple of things being shown that are a little bit different. Interestingly enough is that the M2 Pro, it's coming out ahead and is performing fairly well, but that's because of a few things. Number one, it has 32 gigabytes memory on the system, double what all the other 2 systems have. So that's the first thing. But what's most surprising is that the M1 is really beating out the M2 on both the 70 and 90% of memory by quite a bit. I find this rather interesting, and this could be attributed to, again, optimization for software, even though I got different comments saying that, you know, there's no need for optimization. I'm like, yeah, there is. And you saw in all these charts, there's no other explanation why certain chips perform well on certain apps and certain ones are not. And this is where the optimization would come in. So adding the Mac Studio into the mix, we can see that the M2 and the Mac Studio are performing just pretty much head to head. In fact, the M2 Pro is a touch faster than these two. Even though it's only just like milliseconds apart, I just think it could be attributed to like just the internal speed of like the read and write between CPU, GPU and everything. But anyway, it's just something to note. It's only a minutia though. So this is just a very tiny portion of your workflow, and in reality, you're not going to notice a difference. Now let's take a look at Photoshop Huge. This is 56 gigabyte. And again, the M2 didn't really do too well on this one at all. M1 is really beating out the M2 and M2 Pro. Based on what we're seeing right now, I have a feeling the M2 Pro may improve with the newer version of Photoshop as they release and optimize a little bit more for the chip. But again, also notice 16 and 32 gigabytes memory. So we have double the amount of memory on the system. But like I said, comparing these two, for example, the M1 and the M2 Pro, I think that I would love to see the numbers a little bit shorter on the M2 Pro. And I think that we may see that with optimization because, for example, on a 32 gigabyte machine, M1 Max, I mean, that one really just pushed it down. That's where I would like to see, for example, the M2. And I think that the M2 Pro can get there with some optimization. And as always, the M1 Ultra is pretty much, again, beating everything all out. All right. Let's take a look at Final Cut Pro, and this is going to be the last thing we look at because Final Cut Pro, this is pretty much just my workflow. It's not a lot. I don't do a lot of filters, a lot of effects, but this is something that works for me. So let's have a look at H.264 export, and this chart is telling us a lot about the encoder-decoder engine. So on the M2 Pro, M2, and also M1, well, these are pretty much singular encoder-decoder. Even though the M2 Pro is a little bit faster than the rest of the machine, is only marginally. It's not until we get to, for example, the M1 Max and the M1 Ultra that we see a larger speed improvement. Now, this being said, the M1 Ultra technically have double the encoder-decoder engine to the M1 Max, but I have yet to realize that potential in my close to 1 year that I have the machine. It may not be more for like H.264, but I haven't really seen that, and that's the codec that I use the most. HEVC export 8-bit is pretty much telling us the same thing, single, double, or quadruple encoder-decoder engine, so you see that there. And ProRes 422, you can see that on the M1 Ultra, we're seeing a little bit of that benefit, more so than, for example, the M1 Max, but with these, I mean, the timing are still just about the same. With regards to ProRes 422, there are a lot of other things happening on the system as well, and that's the reason why you're seeing the time cascade the way how it is. So if you're constantly mastering your files in ProRes 422, I would definitely go for at least the Pro at the very minimum. All right, as usual, what does all of this mean? Great question. So I think the first thing we're going to do is address, should you upgrade? If you have, for example, the M1, should you upgrade to the M2 or the M2 Pro? Let's first take a look at the M1 and M2 in comparison. I say that if you're not looking for a machine with a lot more performance, you're looking for some tasks that are going to run faster, you're looking to get more RAM. For example, if 16 is not doing it for you, you want to get 24. I say that going from M1 to M2 may be a good idea. However, when you really start to configure that M2, for instance, with 24 gigabytes of RAM, you start to build everything up. The price, again, is going to be within a stone's throw distance to the M2 Pro, and you may be better off going that route. However, if you have the M1 and you're considering the M2 Pro, I would say definitely get the M2 Pro. I mean, it is a much better chip, a much better machine, a much better performance in almost every single regards of the testing that I have actually shown you pretty much in this video. And mind you, that is only the base M2 Pro chip with a RAM upgrade. Now, one of the things too that I also want to point out is that, again, if you configure, for example, the Mac Mini with the M2 Pro, it's coming in within a striking distance of a base Mac Studio M1 Max, and that's absolutely true. The configuration that I have matches, for example, the SSD at 512. It matches the memory at 32, although with the Mac Studio, you have the option to choose 64 gigabyte memory if you want more. With regards to the M2, you're pretty much capped at 32, so if you need more than that, well, you have to go up to the next system. Although, let me put it this way, I don't think that the M1 Max chip was ever a really impressive chip for me because it just has pretty much more GPU cores on the chip. However, once you reach the max amount of CPU cores on the chip, for example, the Pro and the Max, you're really looking at the same amount of CPU cores. What you're really paying extra for are pretty much the GPU. Slightly different story with the M2 because you have two of those configuration right there. Now, here's the thing. Between upgrading the chip and upgrading the RAM, I made this comment already in my configuration video that you're probably going to see more result from upgrading the RAM rather than upgrading the chip, and we're really seeing that. Even this base chip right now, this one, it's really beating out the M1 Max in majority of the tests. Not every one yet, because there's some optimization that could happen, but in many of the tests that we have gone through, it's already beating that. So personally, if I was configuring this, and I did configure this, and I'm going to keep this machine, obviously, I have actually configured this at the base chip, and I upgraded the RAM, so $100 more compared to like $300, but you're going to get a heap more benefit from it, and I definitely recommend doing and going this route instead. So the other thing too is so that your machine price is not so much so that it's only $100 apart, but this one is still sitting at around $300 apart from the Mac Studio. So those are just things to think about. Obviously, if you add more storage on the Mac Studio, the price would go up, very similar to the Mac Mini with M2 Pro as well. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Mac Mini M2 and Mac Mini M2 Pro. Like I said before, there's no one size fit all. Even though somebody was explaining that to me, I do understand the whole thing. But here's the thing, you have to really choose these computers based on what you need and configure them based on your workflow and how you need to work them. And yes, we may want the day that everything is modular, we can upgrade things, but that's no longer the reality that we live in. So this is the reality that we are, and hopefully the guide that I made is going to help you choose the best machine that best fit with your workflow. And as usual, I mean, if you have questions, you want to know how much RAM to get, all those kind of things, I mean, there's a lot of people already have been telling me this is my workflow, this is what I'm going to do. What do you think about this? Feel free to do that. I'll be more than happy to answer those questions for you. If you have any comments, again, or questions, leave them below. Give us a like, subscribe, and hit the bell when you're new. And in Art we trust.